Welcome back, friends. Sorry I've been gone for so long. I decided to take a week off just between the channel, work, and some other things. I decided I just needed a week to myself. But we are back, and today we have arrived at the end of our series. Thanks so much for joining us this far. Today we'll be discussing the last in our Assassin series, and it will have two for the cost of one. Last time we discussed the attempt on Richard Nixon by Sam Bick. But this will lead us into our attempts today. Today we will be discussing the attempts on the life of President Gerald Ford. Now, Ford is the president who was never elected to office. He's actually the only president who was never elected to office. What do I mean by this? Well, after Spiro Agnew resigned as Nixon's VP in 1973, Nixon for a short period didn't actually have one. But Ford would be appointed in December of 1973 to be Nixon's new vice president. Before this, he was the House Minority Leader in the House of Representatives. So when Nixon finally resigned in 1974, Ford was made president, the first non-elected president in the history of the United States. So this already put many people on edge. As now the first citizen, the commander-in-chief, the president was not chosen by the people. But Ford did not help his case when he then, in October 8th, 3 days after the first attempt on his life, he pardoned Richard Nixon from charges being held up against him from the Watergate scandal. Ford's presidency was an example of the bureaucratic state out of control. But this takes us to our first assassin, Lynette Alice Fromm, or as she's better known, Squeaky Fromme. Fromm was from California and had a pretty average childhood. She was also the member of a dance group that appeared on cable and also performed at the White House. However, as she got older, she fell victim to drugs and alcohol. Her grades suffered, and then she dropped out of college, where she would then, in 1967, meet a man in California known as Charlie. She became a founding member of the Charlie Manson family at the Spahn Ranch. She would be arrested in the Tate LeBlanc murders, but would continue to protest for her, in quote, family's freedom. And Charles Manson's. She then did her best to continue Charlie's, in quote, mission for the years following, involving attempting to contact Led Zeppelin's guitarist, Jimmy Page. Now, the musical assassins tried to make it Fromm was doing it for Charlie, but her story is very different. As much like Hinckley, she is still alive now. She said she was trying to save the California Redwoods from logging camps that were threatening to damage the ecosystem of the forest. When she approached the commander of the Army Engineer Corps, he simply responded, "I'm sorry, I am just following orders." So feeling defeated, she decided to take it up to the top. She discovered that Ford was going to be speaking in Sacramento on the 5th, and in some way believed that she had the perfect tactic to get the president's attention. So on September 5th, 1975, President Ford was visiting Sacramento, California. Ford needed California votes desperately in order to remain in office in the 1976 election. So when Republicans in California invited him to the event, he of course immediately hopped on it. So after being at a luncheon on the 5th, Ford went out to greet supporters. But at 10:02 a.m., he decided to go out and shake hands with people. He noticed a woman in a complete red dress yelling to him and gesturing for him. He became interested and slowly made his way over to the woman. Suddenly through the crowd, a 1911 semi-automatic revolver appeared, pointed directly at him. Onlookers could hear the handgun clicking several times. Quickly, Squeaky is arrested and put into custody. Now, there was no round in the chamber. This is one of the first attempts that a revolver was actually not used. So, in order for a 1911 handgun to work, you need to pull the stock back, which pulls the hammer back. This is what will then click the semi-automatic feature into action. So you pull back, that brings the hammer back, and it also engages the rest of the clip. So the first assumption was Squeaky was just another unhinged member of the Manson family who failed at an attempt to kill the president. But Squeaky would instead say she purposely did not chamber a round and ejected one of the rounds before going to the field. Upon investigating her apartment, police did actually find a bullet sitting on the floor in the apartment. Regardless, she'd be sentenced to life in prison for the attempt to kill the president. But she would be paroled in August 2009 for good behavior and is now settled in the state of New York. She did an interview in 2019 where she admitted she was still in love with Charles Manson and maintained her defense that she was never going to kill Ford. But like I said earlier, there was 2 women. And also, as I said earlier, 3 days after the first attempt, Ford would pardon Nixon, who was looking to be indicted for crimes involved in the Watergate scandal. So this brings us to Sara Jane Moore, another woman who is still alive today. Moore was from West Virginia, had been divorced 5 times and had 4 children. She was a volunteer bookkeeper for the Hearst-backed charity The People in Need. But this wasn't her actual revenue. Moore was actually an FBI informant that was feeding the Bureau information on the organization, which they believed was corrupt. But Moore herself was slowly getting involved in left-wing extremism. Much like Sam Bick, the Secret Service actually investigated Moore and deemed her not to be a threat to the president. Actually, on September 21st, she had been arrested by the police and her .44 caliber revolver confiscated. But the next day, on the 22nd, she hastily purchased a new revolver, a .38 caliber. Now, instead of being in Sacramento, Ford was speaking in San Francisco at the World Affairs Council, an organization founded to add in international affairs organizations around the world, which still exists to this day. After finishing his speech at the council, he entered San Francisco's Union Square. 40 feet away was a crowd of people cheering at the president. On his way to the limousine, he stopped to wave to the crowd, when at 3:30, 2 shots rang out. Quickly, they brought Ford into cover, the first shot having missed him by only inches, hitting the door of the hotel the council was in at the time. The second shot then went through the door, hitting a taxi cab driver named John Ludwig inside the hotel. Luckily, Ludwig would survive. Moore was quickly tackled by a former Marine named Oliver Sipple, who grabbed her arm to stop her. Then, after the president was racing off, SFPD Captain Hedrich arrested her. Now, she would not explain her reasons initially, but much like Fromm, she would be sentenced to life imprisonment. But also, much like Fromm, she would be released and paroled for good behavior in December of 2007. She'd be arrested again in 2019 for failing to inform her parole officer when she had gone on a vacation outside the country, but she would be released that same year. On an interview with NBC's Today, Moore finally admitted to why she did it, and also discussed great remorse for having tried to kill the president. Her reason was she listening to her left-wing extremists believed that the country was 5 seconds from a full-out revolution or civil war. She believed that had she killed Ford, it would have set off the war and not put blame of the murder on those who she followed and supported. But after 30 years in prison, educating herself, she realized how very wrong she was, and would even say she was happy that her attempt had failed. As for Ford, he would not win the election of 1976, losing to the former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, actually who he was very close friends with up until his death. Carter, another individual who is actually still alive today. Ford, at the end of the day, really had no chance. The Republican Party had lost all credibility due to the actions of Richard Nixon, and Ford, all he was at the end of the day, was an acting president serving until the next election. An unelected president who believed he had a chance to drag the GOP out of the dust. That would not happen, however, until 1981, when Ronald Reagan would lead the Republican Party into a new era. So ends this series. I know this was a dark series, but as I said on our channel's mission, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And these 11 individuals though mentally unstable, cannot be forgotten, because we must know the signs in order to stop these things from happening in the future and ever again. Thanks for joining us for this finale. After 2 weeks, this is our first straight series since Gettysburg, and I thank you all for joining me through it. If you enjoyed the series, please like, share, and comment, and if you're new, please subscribe by hitting that tiny red button. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.